Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space. Hope you enjoy. Story number 1. All Work, No Play, written by Heathborn. We found the humans. We were immediately baffled by their stupidity. Long before actually meeting them, their transmissions reached our senses. If the contents of these radio signals surprised us, their form was even stranger, at least to my forebearers of the revered order of military intelligence. After-action combat reports from places we had never discovered detailed depictions of life forms we had yet to encounter. Some were highly detailed, while others were crudely replicated, obviously after the fact. But the strangest of all, every single scrap of information was entirely unencrypted, transmitting everything in the clear, as if taunting the universe to take them on. Needless to say, we kept our distance. The annals speak of much disagreement in those days, erupting between the revered order and the various martial branches. In the end, however, cooler heads prevailed. We would take our time, study the human, and figure out what kind of enemy our militants would one day be facing. Only then would we strike. But there was much to figure out. Their transmissions clearly showed advanced starships of baffling capabilities, with several astounding new ways to approach FTL travel. These designs had clearly been put to good use, as we saw conclusive evidence of humanity having operated at an intergalactic level for ages already, by the time we put them in our scopes. Yet, for all of this, all their broadcasts emanating from a single world, there were many hypotheses as to why. A popular early thesis posited that the humans were using an underdeveloped world as a lure. It was bait, pure and simple, put in a place to draw out more gullible races and annihilate their warships. Then, the responsible philosopher monks suggested the humans would move on to massacre and enslave the aggressors' populations, plunder their resources, and integrate their technologies. It was a popular idea because it fit. The humans appeared to be a bloodthirsty, warlike race, hungry for resources and eager to enslave. It would also explain the vast variety of starship designs in their arsenal, and why we had yet to meet any of the races they had clearly encountered so far. And thus, enormous resources were dedicated to exploring this possibility. The blood of the serfs ran forth in rivers around the many great shipyards of Werfte. Their ritual sacrifice was celebrated across hundreds of worlds, as the venerable order of Starflight dedicated their hearts to thousands of new scout ships commissioned to find the real human strongholds. But in the end, they could find nothing. When the responsible matriarch of Starflight fell on her pike after 16 consecutive standard revolutions without results, a new approach was required. The new matriarch was certain of the general idea driving her predecessor, but had a new concept for its execution. Rather than mapping out every planet, moon, and asteroid in the humans' local cluster, we need to look closely, not widely. Their cloaking technology, as we could plainly see in their provocative broadcasting, was after all quite impressive. Thus guided, we redoubled our efforts. The new scout ships were recalled, their sensors thrown on pyres, and new ones were commissioned, as the threat was considered grave. We reallocated resources from several key sectors of our economy to fashion detectors capable of seeing through every conceivable disguise. But another 20 standard revolutions passed, and another matriarch had to fall on her pike. The next idea came from the holy order of all-engulfing fire. The planet killer's philosopher monks worried that mankind's presence in our galaxy was only a small outpost, a beachhead from which they would one day, inevitably, launch a campaign of total destruction. As was their habit, the Holy Order's first own suggestions to remedy the situation was to strike first, to wipe out the beachhead and to fortify the rest of the rim. This was generally taken to be a prudent idea, if not for the fact that humans could clearly tunnel through space and end up behind our defenses. Thus panicked, we started looking beyond the rim. At great expense, when greater haste, stealthy outposts were erected, with the largest and most stealthy scopes we could build. We scanned the void incessantly for the possible incoming fleet. Entire crews of order of spaceflight succumbing under the stress of exhaustion from the intense effort. Meanwhile, Our greatest minds turned their talents to creating detectors for the space beneath real space, that void within the void that we had never seen, but which the humans were traversing with such ease. Their efforts were ultimately in vain, but not for lack of trying. The final effort in pursuing this hypothesis was the constructing of 4 great warships. Packed with militants and scholars, we sent them forth into the darkness in the hope of one day reaching a distant galaxy and establishing relations with the humans on their own turf. It would take generations, but it was deemed worthwhile. After all, it could be what spared our own galaxy. Eventually, however, the world ships were lost. Intergalactic space swallowed them whole, one by one, never even encountering the humans. The last idea to be thoroughly investigated was the brainchild of a lowly technician of an altar of recycling, speaking directly to a high priest of cartography as they passed in a hallway. The technician suggested that maybe the humans were already gone, their planet just blindly broadcasting the recirculated transmissions of a dead race. The technician was naturally piked for his insolence, but the high priest pondered the idea aloud in a plenary session shortly after. By now, our entire society had solemnly focused on humans for generations. We had peered into the darkness and lifted every rock, constantly searching for more of them. It had been a very long time since we had actually looked at the planet from which these troublesome radio waves first came. This was deemed a grave dereliction of duty from the revered order of military intelligence, and my predecessor fell on his pike. Thus I took up the rod and staff of intelligence and set out to correct his reverence's mistake. And when the scout reports came back, I was immediately baffled by our stupidity. Apparently, the humans were now a spacefaring species in their own right. This, it turned out, was a new development for them, but they were already quite formidable. Thankfully, they were all too happy to simply make our acquaintance, having never met another sapient species. One of our first questions, if we could exchange entertainment in order to build understanding of our respective societies. Then they explained to us the concept of entertainment. End of story. Story number 2. Where to? Written by Echoing Cascade. Dylan was on the bridge of the Minerva, a prototype long-range scouting vessel. He was getting ready for the voyage home. It didn't take too long, a few hours at most of travel. He couldn't wait to see Henry and tell him all he had seen on the Minerva's first flight. He'll be so jealous, but once I finish the voyage home, I can show him all the footage we captured. Hell, the samples alone will keep him occupied for months. He continued to chart the path the ship would need to take for the voyage home, but he suddenly stopped. Why do I keep thinking of it as the voyage home? He tried to focus on that thought, but every time he seemed to get close to the answer, the idea remained just out of reach. He gave up and shrugged. Not important, I guess. Dylan had finished his calculations, but then the memory that had escaped him had resurfaced. As it often does once you stop actively thinking about it. It was a conversation he had with Henry last week. Dylan, I can't believe he thinks the voyage home is better than the undiscovered country. His screams were deafening. Screams! He chuckled to himself for a moment, then his eyes went wide, and he stopped what he was doing. Dozens of creatures stopped eating the Minerva's bridge crew and looked at where Dylan was sitting. What was left of his torso, head and arms were propped up in the captain's chair, held in place by a giant centipede-like creature, coiled around his body. Dylan stared at pushing buttons again, setting a course. Undiscovered country. The Minerva wasn't heard of for centuries. It was found adrift in the middle of nowhere by a cargo ship charting new trade routes. Inside was the desiccated remains of 100 giant insects. After some research, they were identified as skidded, insectoid predators with limited psychic abilities. No one knows how they got on board or how they failed to get the crew to ferry them into human territories, or why the last navigation coordinates read, second star to the right, and straight on till morning. End of story. I just quickly want to thank my Tier 5 channel members and patrons. Casper Arnholtz, Cam Maxwell, Barkey, It's Difficult to Pronounce, Lord Asrical, Oakfield, and Dragzoon WRE. Thank you very much.